My name is Johanna Wickman. We're going to talk a little bit about Preston Plumb today. Those of you that were here for my morning program, you're going to get a little bit of the 11th Kansas again, because I am going to talk about that. But this is more about who Preston Plumb was and his career as a senator and how he impacted this country and Kansas. Just for some background on me, I've been working in museums for the past 15 years. I live in Casper, Wyoming. I'm the vice president of the Fort Casper Museum Association, and the 11th Kansas was actually stationed at Fort Casper, and that's how I found Preston Plumb in my research, in case you're wondering, why is someone from Wyoming here talking about Preston Plumb from Kansas? That's why. This has been a labor of love for me for about the last decade. All of the research I've compiled consists of a lot of work that Kansas historian William Connolly conducted in 1910 through about 1913. He actually wrote a biography on Plumb and interviewed hundreds of people who knew Plumb personally, whether it was fellow soldiers, his family, fellow senators, early Kansas pioneers, and basically just collected stories from them. And it's those stories that I've compiled and put into the book. The book is primarily those stories. It's not me talking so much as it is the stories. But a lot of these stories are fantastic and have never been published before and never been told. So a lot of hopefully new information in here about his significance. Preston Plumb was probably one of the most significant senators Kansas has ever had. He accomplished a tremendous amount in his short Senate career, but we'll go ahead and get started. So who was this guy? Preston Plumb was born October 12th, 1837 in Ohio. Mauled by a bear at age 9. What a way to start your childhood. There was a farm nearby where he grew up where they had 2 pet bears that they kept chained in a barn, as one does. And they also installed a swing from the ceiling for kids to play on, right next to the bears, as one does. Yeah. And he was in there at 9 years old with some friends, his brother, and he was pushing another friend, a girl, on the swing, and he slipped and fell and rolled right in front of one of the bears, who snatched him up and started mauling him. Luckily for him, the 2 bears started fighting each other, and he was able to crawl to safety. When this happened, he was not expected to survive. He got severe wounds across his abdomen, and he lost about 1 pound of flesh on one of his legs. I'm not sure if it was his right leg or his left leg, but he was not expected to survive. And during his recovery, he actually taught himself how to knit, and he was quite proud of being able to knit socks that could hold water. He was that good of a knitter. His family was, very limited means. His father was a wagon maker. They did not have money to send him to college, but both of his parents really wanted him to pursue something better. They did not want him to follow into the family business of wagon making. They wanted him to do something else. And so he wanted to go to Kenyon College. The family could not afford the tuition, and so he actually paid for his room and board through learning the printing trade. He actually worked printing Bibles, so setting that very, very small type at Kenyon College. And he really found a love for printing through that process, which he would carry with him for the rest of his life. So what's happening around kind of the same time is the Free State movement is kicking up in the Kansas territory after the Kansas-Nebraska Act of 1854. And Plumb becomes very interested in this. He starts following what's going on in Kansas. Of course, he's still living in Ohio. He's finished school, and in 1856, he starts his own newspaper. And this is very important. This is the Xenia News. He's 16 years old. And I mean, I don't know what you were doing at 16, but starting my own newspaper was not anything anywhere close to my mind. But he starts the Xenia News at 16 years old, and really, again, becomes devoted to the Free State cause. And when the first sacking of Lawrence happens, he decides he wants to come down to the Kansas territory and basically see what's going on for himself. And he turns himself into a newspaper correspondent for his newspaper. He travels all around, interviews people in Lawrence, in Kansas City, in Lecompton, all over, and writes down what people are saying of what's going on and sends it back to Ohio where it's printed in his Xenia News. And this article here is just a review of the newspaper when it first started. It was a very popular paper. There were a lot of subscribers in other states, not just Ohio. And after he comes through here, sending these letters back to Ohio, he really falls in love with Kansas and the Kansas territory. And so he decides he wants to move here permanently. But he doesn't want to just move here like most people do. He's going to move here and also smuggle weapons at the same time. So in 1856, he comes back. This is in the late fall of 1856. And he smuggles weapons. He's got a cannon. He's got Bowie knives. He's got thousands of rounds of ammunition. He's got Sharps rifles. He's got 3 wagons of munitions to support the Free State movement. And he's in charge of a company of about a dozen men. He's the youngest, and yet he's in charge. Very much a go-getter type personality, very headstrong. This personality is really something that allows him to achieve all of the things that he does later in life. When he puts his mind to something and decides he's going to do it, he does it. After they bring the weapons into Lawrence, Kansas, he decides that he wants to found a town. Now, the first town he founds is actually called Mariposa, and it's about where present-day Salina is. And they set that up in the late fall, early winter of 1856, and it is not successful. They have a hard time getting settlers there, and they basically get frozen out from their supplies. And so gradually the town site is abandoned. He goes back to Lawrence, where he's working at the Herald of Freedom newspaper, and he gets word that there's this Emporia Town Company, and they need a 5th person. And it's $1,000 buy-in, which in 1857 is a lot of money. So his parents actually mortgage their home in Ohio, their farm, to give him the money so that he can buy in to the town company. And the town company accepts him on condition that he start a newspaper in Emporia, Kansas. Because if you have a newspaper, that's the perfect way to bring people in. Otherwise, you can start a town and no one will come to it. And so he moves to Emporia. He's the only member of the town company who actually does live in Emporia. In those days, there were a lot of town companies, investors would buy into them, and basically just an investment scheme. This town is going to grow, and then I'm going to sell off the lots of land that I bought for my initial investment and get a profit. And so Plumb was different in that he was very much interested in founding a town and then ensuring that it grew. And so in order to start his newspaper, he has to get a printing press to Emporia, Kansas, which, of course, this is now almost a frontier. This is in the middle of nowhere. The only structure there is a hotel that doesn't even have a floor in it yet. It has a dirt floor. And so to get a newspaper press, he has to go to Cincinnati, Ohio, which means he has to go through Missouri. And he had become so involved within the Free State movement, attending Free State rallies, things like that. He was recognizable at this point. And so he takes a steamer across the river into Missouri, and he's recognized. And so the pro-slavery men say, oh, we know who you are, we're going to hang you. And Plumb, being who he was as a personality, that did not deter him at all. The story was that he just kept spouting insults at the pro-slavery men who had captured him, which so impressed another pro-slavery man on the ship that he actually stood up for Plumb and saved his life. And had it not been for that man, Plumb would have been hung trying to get his printing press to Kansas, which is interesting because the man that stood up for him, his son later became a U.S. Senator who served with Plumb in the Senate. So they knew each other. So kind of a small world thing. But he gets his printing press back to Kansas. They set it up in the hotel on the dirt floor in Emporia, and he starts printing the Kansas News. And you'll notice it's Kansas with a Z. That is on purpose. The Z at that time indicated that it was a Free State leaning newspaper. So people immediately could look at the masthead and say, okay, this is the kind of news I'm going to be reading. It's Free State leaning. Not long after that, he catches smallpox. So he's been mauled by a bear and almost froze to death at Mariposa, and now he's got smallpox. He catches smallpox while he's trying to get news stories. So in order for him to get news to print in his newspaper, he has to travel to Lawrence very frequently, because that's kind of the happening place. That's where things are going on that are of interest. And so if the family is not using the horse, his whole family has moved to Emporia with him at this point. And if they're not using the horse, he can take the horse to Lawrence. If they are, he has to walk. And that's 70 miles. And so on one of his walks to Lawrence to get the news, he runs across a man who has smallpox, and he's basically quarantined in this cabin, and no one's there taking care of him. And so Plumb arranges to have a gal who had already had smallpox nurse this man back to health. He pays for it. Well, in the course of all this, he ends up getting smallpox himself. He returns to Emporia, and then he's the one that's quarantined. And this was another case where he was not expected to survive. His smallpox was terrible. There's a story of him giving a speech in Emporia, a political speech, and he had his hat on. Of course, when you're giving a speech and addressing a crowd, you should remove your hat. That's etiquette. And he wouldn't take his off, and the crowd kept hollering at him, "Take off your hat, take off your hat." And so he finally did, and then they could see all of his hair had fallen out. He had gotten smallpox that bad. He carried the scars with him for the rest of his life. While he was a senator, there were newspapers that used to make fun of him for being scarred. They'd call him the pockmarked senator. It was something that really kind of haunted him for a while. He decides in 1860 that he wants to become a lawyer. And so he goes back to Ohio for a little while, learns the law, comes back to Emporia, and has a law firm. So now he's got a newspaper and a law firm. He's doing quite a bit of business, selling real estate. He's a notary. And he also then gets elected to the state's legislature. He's serving there, and he's also serving as the state Supreme Court reporter. And all this time, he's in his very early 20s. So he's about 21, 22, 23 years old. This is a classified ad from his newspaper, and hopefully it's large enough for folks to read, but this I wanted to put in there because I think it's funny. You can see Plumb and McClung, of course that's him, and then Lee McClung was one of his associates who had come down into Kansas with him when they were smuggling weapons. Lee also worked at the newspaper with him. And the top one, a governor for Kansas, men of principle and conscience need not apply. Politics hasn't changed all that much, I suppose. And this was kind of a joke because at the time of the publication of this newspaper, the Kansas Territory had already had 5 governors, and would get another one before the end of the year. They were going through governors like crazy. But you can see from these other 2 ads, they're selling cattle, selling real estate, he was selling insurance, providing notary services, doing a lot of things in Emporia. The other thing that's going on at the same time is there are concerns of what they were called border ruffians, pro-slavery bushwhackers coming in and ransacking towns. They would burn businesses, loot them, burn homesteads. It was a very dangerous time, and so the town of Emporia and many other towns around had their own militias. Plumb was in charge of the Emporia militia and actually used to ride patrols all around eastern Kansas. This picture here depicts a court-martial that Plumb was prosecuting. He's the one standing and pointing. That's, well, right there, in the white shirt. That's Plumb. This was in retaliation for the sacking of the town of Humboldt. And also gives you an idea, here he is working with Colonel Blunt. James Blunt, of course, would go on to be General Blunt, who he would serve with during the Civil War. A lot of these people had known each other for many years before the war broke out. But just another example of, now he's a militia captain, a newspaper editor, a lawyer, a state legislator, a state Supreme Court reporter, selling real estate, a notary, and selling insurance. That's like 8 jobs, I think. He's a busy guy. So the Civil War breaks out in April of '61, and Plumb wants to enlist right away. And the people of Emporia convinced him not to, because at that time the state legislature is determining county boundaries and county seats. And they really want Emporia to be the county seat. So he holds out on enlisting until the fall of 1862, after all of the county boundaries are established. And he enlists in the 11th Kansas Volunteer Infantry as a recruiting lieutenant. He recruits Company C and then part of Company E. Companies were made up of 100 men, so he recruited so many he filled up one whole company and then overflowed into a second company. He also recruited a number of men who did not pass the physical. They were not deemed well enough or healthy enough to serve, and he made sure that they could still serve in the 11th Kansas, only they were now the band. They went in as musicians. And there are several accounts of the 11th Kansas band not being very good. It could be because they primarily weren't musicians. They were the guys that failed the physical, basically, but they could still serve. So right away he's promoted to captain of Company C, and almost immediately after that he's elected major of the 11th Kansas Infantry. Their first battle is the Battle of Prairie Grove on December 7th, 1862. Most people think of Pearl Harbor Day on December 7th, but now I always think of Prairie Grove. That's what comes to mind first. The 11th Kansas was fairly unique in that they had a regimental newspaper. It was called the Buck and Ball, and the reason it had that name was because the regiment was issued initially these antiquated Prussian muskets. They were oversized, they had a longer barrel, they were about 50 years old, kind of left over from the War of 1812. And they fired 1 musket ball and 3 shots of buckshot. And the men used to joke that they should have been classified as heavy artillery instead of infantry with these things. They started making the Buck and Ball newspaper. You'll see it's dated December 6th, the day before the Battle of Prairie Grove. They found a printing press that had been destroyed by the Confederates. They put it back together. Preston Plumb, Edmund Ross, some other men in the regiment who had printing experience, and they start putting it back together and basically writing, here's what we did each day so far. It's a great resource for information. If you look at it closely, you can see that some of the letters aren't quite right, like this T in Tabor is italicized, and that's because this printing press was put back together after being destroyed, and the type was scattered, and they didn't have enough letters to make everything correct as it should be. It reads almost kind of like those ransom letters where they cut out letters and paste them all together. So sometimes you'll have an italicized letter where it shouldn't be, you'll have a 0 that should be an O, things like that. But they got their newspaper out and they printed the first half. It's a single sheet, front and back, and they printed the front on December 6th. Well, then the Battle of Prairie Grove broke out, and so the men had to go to the lines and start fighting. So Plumb took all of the copies of the newspaper that had been printed on the front, rolled them all into a bundle, and threw them into an ambulance that went racing by. And that was the last he saw of the newspaper until after the battle. The Battle of Prairie Grove happens. It's their first test of heavy combat. The 11th Kansas does very well in the battle. After the battle, they have to take care of the wounded. There's a lot of things to clean up afterwards, and a few days later, Plumb actually finds the newspapers that he had printed and is able to take them back to the printing press, which has been destroyed again, put it back together again, and then they print the second half. And the second half actually has a whole description of the Battle of Prairie Grove. But it's funny because it's dated December 6th and the battle was on the 7th, which is why there's a discrepancy there. The paper was printed on military paper, it was printed on wallpaper, it was printed on whatever paper they could find. They only printed about 1,500 copies. I have never actually seen one in person. They are very, very rare. The University of Arkansas has one, which this scan is from, and it's unclear if there's even any others out there. Word got up to General Schofield in the Union Army that the 11th Kansas was making a newspaper, and he quickly squashed the newspaper. And so the Buck and Ball was volume 1 and number 1, and there was never another issue. More than likely because he was afraid of information possibly getting spread to the Confederate Army or, falling into the wrong hands. So that was the end of the newspaper. In 1863, the regiment is converted to cavalry. This was not an easy conversion. As most things with the federal government, it was kind of painful. When you're converted to cavalry, you trade in your muskets for carbines. Carbines are shorter. They're typically, well, Spencers are repeating carbines. Some of them had repeating carbines, some of them had single shot carbines. But they take cartridge ammunition, which makes it much easier to load and fire on horseback. Well, the way they were converted to cavalry, some of the companies got carbines and no horses, some of the companies got horses and no carbines. And so this dragged on for a couple of months before they all had horses and had carbines. During the war in 63 and 64, primarily they spend this time on the Kansas-Missouri border in that area, fighting guerrillas and bushwhackers. So not the traditional Civil War combat that you think of with the Confederate Army and the Union Army marching out and meeting each other on the battlefield. This was much more like guerrilla warfare of small groups of soldiers going through the woods looking for other bushwhackers, essentially. The big event in 1863 is Quantrill's raid on Lawrence in August. This was something where Plumb was in command of the district at the time, and after Quantrill had attacked Lawrence, it was Plumb's job to pursue Quantrill and hopefully catch him. He took a lot of flack for this after it was all said and done, because he was unable to catch Quantrill. And the reason for that is because after the attack, he would receive information, Quantrill went this way, and he'd go that way, and then he'd get information, no, he went that way. And they ended up going back and forth, could not catch up with him, but spent 24 hours straight riding in the saddle with no breaks, no food. Many of the men and their horses were collapsing of exhaustion. Some of the horses died. It was a very, very difficult time. But Quantrill's raid was something that would kind of come back to haunt Plumb later in his Senate career. The folks of Lawrence kind of still held a grudge for that for many years afterwards. In April of 1864, he's promoted to a lieutenant colonel. Again, he's still fighting bushwhackers along the Kansas and Missouri border, primarily. The main event that happens for him in 1864 is the Battle of Westport, sometimes called the Gettysburg of the West. This was a battle that had 30,000 soldiers involved. This took place in Kansas City, Missouri, right in town. You can't even get to where the battlefield was now. But this was the traditional Civil War battle that you think of, Confederate Army on one side and the Union Army on the other. This was especially significant for Plumb. This drawing I had done kind of shows it a little bit better, but you can see from Wellhouse's description, what happened for the 11th Kansas is that the Confederate Army was entrenched behind a stone wall at the top of a hill. And what they were trying to do was basically sweep down the hill and into Kansas. And if they had been successful, if the 11th Kansas was unable to stop them, they would have gone right into Kansas, which would have caused a whole lot of problems for the folks in Kansas. Plumb had to lead a dismounted cavalry charge up a hill, which militarily is not what you want to do. This is about the worst thing you can do. But even with the odds stacked against them, they were successful. They were able to take the Confederate position and stop them from going into Kansas. So again, militarily, this is incredibly significant, and this was Plumb's dismounted cavalry charge. He led this. So this was a big event for him and his regiment. In 1865, the Civil War ends in April, but the 11th Kansas actually heads west instead. Some of them, when they enlisted, signed 3 years or duration of the war enlistment. Those men definitely felt that they should be going home. The Civil War is over. Some of the men, when they enlisted, signed 3-year enlistments. The government chose to say all of them signed 3 years enlistments. And so they were sent to the Wyoming Territory to protect the telegraph route from Native American attacks. And they were stationed roughly near Platte Bridge Station, which is now called Fort Casper, in Casper, Wyoming, where I'm from. So here's my connection to Plumb. He established Camp Dodge at the base of Casper Mountain, about 5 miles away. This is a drawing of what Camp Dodge looked like. Just recently we discovered that it was a permanent encampment with 3 buildings and tents. Prior to that we thought it was just a temporary tent encampment, so this is something that just within the last couple of years we found new information, which tells you, you never always know everything. There's always new things in history you can learn. In June of 1865, they're involved in their first skirmish there. This is on June 3rd. This is when a group of Sioux Native Americans attack Fort Casper, and basically what they would do is fire some shots at the fort and try to draw the men out into a running battle. And they're successful in doing that. Plumb and the 11th Kansas chase them for about 7 to 10 miles. And the end result of that is that they're led right into an ambush. Plumb recognizes that the ambush is coming and orders a retreat. So most of the men are saved. However, there's one 11th Kansas soldier and one 11th Ohio soldier who are killed in that fight. In June of 1865, later on, Plumb is sent down to Fort Halleck, which is again also in present-day Wyoming, close to the town of Laramie, if any of you have been there. It's in the mountains in Laramie. There's only one building left, the old blacksmith shop. And while he's at Fort Halleck, he's in command of the entire overland mail route. So his job is to protect the mail that is coming and going east to west along that route. Some of the 11th Kansas have remained up in the Casper area, and they're involved in some battles there that I talked about earlier. In September of 1865, they are finally mustered out. Plumb's last diary entry in his 1865 diary is "Home from the wars forever," and he even underlined it just like that in his diary. And you can imagine, as someone who had been working with the Free State movement, fighting in Kansas militia, protecting towns since basically, 1856, he'd been fighting for almost a decade. So being home from that was especially poignant for him. So what he does next, in 1867, he marries Carolyn Carey Southwick from Ohio. Her father, Abijah, ran a critical underground railroad stop in Ohio. She was a strong abolitionist. She was well educated. She was very involved in social causes. So her and Plumb were kind of on the same wavelength there, very involved in the same things. They had 6 children. One of them, Thomas, died when he was about 2 years old, but they had 5 children that survived. Also, what's going on then is he goes back to the state legislature. In 1867, he's Speaker of the House for the state of Kansas. He also becomes president of the Emporia National Bank, and his law firm, Ruggles and Plumb, is one of the most successful in the state. He would travel all over the state of Kansas. He took clients on as far away as Texas. He practiced law anywhere. He would ride a horse and buggy anywhere somebody needed him. He had an incredible work ethic. He was still doing that while he was president of the Emporia National Bank. As president of the bank, he saved the bank from financial collapse in the 1870s. There was a tremendous financial collapse that affected a lot of small town banks. A lot of them folded. He was able to keep the Emporia National Bank going. And then as Speaker of the House and the state legislature, he was very involved in a number of state issues, all at the same time. Again, the man kept himself busy. In 1877, he decides he wants to do more than just be in the state legislature. So he runs for the U.S. Senate. He's elected as a Republican senator from Kansas and immediately went to work introducing bills. This is key. So there's sort of an unwritten rule in the Senate that when you're the junior senator, you're newly elected, you just go to the Senate and you just sit and watch. You just see how things are for a while. Then maybe introduce a bill, or maybe, stand up and talk about something. Well, that wasn't his personality. He went to the Senate because he wanted to do things. He had things he wanted to do. He had bills he wanted to get through. And so immediately he starts introducing bills. Bills are coming up in the Senate that he disagrees with. He's right away speaking against them, and the other senators are just aghast. And there's stories of them saying, who is this guy from Kansas? We've never even heard of him. All of a sudden he shows up. He's 40 years old. He's very young for a senator, and he's just introducing bills. If things come up that he disagrees with, he'll vote against him. Even if he's the only senator voting against it, he doesn't care. He votes for what he thinks is right. He's an extreme workaholic. He was known to skip meals for a couple of days, sometimes not sleep at all for a couple of days. He took care of every issue himself. So if someone went to him and said, look, I'm having trouble with some issue with my land and making sure I can keep my farm, he would take care of it himself. If a veteran went to him and said, I'm having trouble getting my pension from when I served in the infantry, he would take care of it himself. He did not have staffers go and do things for him. He did it all himself. And so even though he's elected in 1877, he rises through the ranks in the Senate very, very quickly, and becomes incredibly influential. And he's also serving alongside Ingalls, J.J. Ingalls, who was a leading senator at the time. And Ingalls had a very different style than Plumb. Plumb was very much, people described him as coming at you with a battle axe when he was arguing in the Senate. Ingalls was more of the educated orator, that kind of personality. But people quickly learned that if you wanted something done, you went to Plumb. Plumb was a doer, Ingalls was a talker. And because of that, when the Republican convention comes around in 1880 to decide on a presidential nominee, Plumb actually finds himself in the middle of this. During the 1880 convention, Ulysses S. Grant, James Blaine, and John Sherman, brother of William Tecumseh Sherman, were the leading candidates for the Republican nomination for president. But the Republican delegates could not agree. They couldn't vote and agree on which one of those. And so Garfield was suggested as sort of a dark horse candidate. No one really expected him. He didn't expect to be nominated for president. But he was someone who came around and began being discussed among the delegates as, well, if I can't get Blaine and I can't get Sherman, I could deal with this Garfield guy. And so he starts gaining some steam, but it's still not really sure whether or not he's going to make the nomination. So what happens is, in the hotel where everyone's staying for this convention, they start having these kind of backdoor meetings. And the real question that comes up is, well, who's Plumb going to vote for? Because at this point, Plumb was so influential, people wanted to back whoever Plumb was going to vote for. So Plumb actually has a number of meetings with Garfield to discuss the nomination. If Garfield were to be elected president, what would Garfield do for Kansas? How could Garfield help Kansas? You know, here's some issues that are important to Plumb. What does Garfield feel about those issues? And to regularly address the Senate and give reports to the Senate as other cabinet departments can. So this was a huge win, not only for the state of Kansas, but also for any other agriculturally based states. He also created the first forestry and conservation laws. Prior to this, there were no regulations on any of that. You could just buy land or just show up and just start logging, whatever. And there was no regulation. And so he established the first forestry laws that later became the basis of the U.S. Forest Service, so that there would become regulations for that. He also pushed through in the Senate the bills that created Yosemite National Park, Sequoia National Park. If any of you have ever been there, that's because Plumb pushed it through the Senate. He also created the Shoshone National Forest in Wyoming, so being from Wyoming, we owe him a debt for that as well. He was the chairman of the Committee of Public Lands. This is probably one of the most powerful positions you can have as a Senate committee member. And he held this position for almost his entire tenure in the United States Senate. Someone coming in? Oh, okay. As chairman of the Committee of Public Lands, he is the one who oversees where all of the railroads go. So in the 1880s, when the railroads are basically expanding like crazy all across the United States, he is the one who oversees all of those land grants to allow the railroads to expand the way they do. He's the one that authorizes them to build certain lines into certain towns, all of those sorts of things. So nothing that the railroad does happens without his committee saying so or approving that. So that's huge. The other thing he did is he was very involved in veterans pensions. At the time of his death, he had submitted over 6,000 veteran pension requests. That's a lot. He spent about 14 years in the Senate. That's a little less than 500 a year. Most senators put through about 30. So he was very, very prolific. The last one that I have mentioned here is the McKinley tariff. This was a tariff that would have raised the cost of goods tremendously, and it did pass, unfortunately. He was against it. And he had tried to come up with different solutions to modify the fees on the tariff, and unfortunately he was unable to do so. But what was really interesting is that it was so important to those that wanted the tariff passed that they were known to go around and bribe senators to make sure it passed. There were at first about a dozen or so holdouts who were against the McKinley tariff, and people were kind of going around, I'm unofficially connected to this senator, but boy, if you'd vote for this, we could maybe see if maybe Senator so-and-so would support your bill to, those kinds of things. When the tariff was finally voted on, it was only Plumb and 2 other senators who voted against it. They were unable to be bribed. They were unable to be bought off. He was lampooned by the Republican Party for going against the Republican Party to vote against the tariff, but he felt that it would raise the cost of goods too much for people, and so he was against it. This was a reputation that he held in the Senate the entire time he was there. He could not be bought. There were letters of people saying, hey, I got word about this mine, you should invest in that. I got word about this, you should invest in that. And personally, I've seen the letters that he sent back to them saying, no, that sounds like a great deal, but because I'm on this committee, I can't invest in that. That would give me an unfair advantage. No, I won't do that. Whenever he rode the trains anywhere for business or personal anywhere, he paid his own railroad fare. Many of the other senators got subsidized railroad tickets. So a certain railroad say, oh, well, you can travel free on our railroad. So then when that railroad says, hey, we want to build a line up north, that'd be all right. We let you travel for free, right? And those senators would vote for it. Because of his position on the Public Lands Committee, he felt that was unethical, which it would have been. And so he paid his own fare so that he would be unbiased on deciding where those railroads could run their lines. So this is only a slim section of what he did in the Senate. One thing I talked about after my program this morning, he also introduced some of the first laws regulating the health of cattle and animals in the country. Prior to this, there was nothing to stop anyone from shipping diseased or sick cattle across state lines and internationally. So what would happen is someone might have a sick cattle in Illinois or Missouri, and it'd come into Kansas and it'd contaminate a herd, or vice versa. And there were no restrictions on that. There was no control, and there was no cooperation between the states saying, hey, I'm in Missouri and we're having an outbreak of such and such disease, and being able to work with neighboring states to then start to cure the disease, eradicate it, etc. He introduced the first laws allowing cooperation between those states through a federally organized program, which is something that is still done today. So his final campaign. Before 1891, I do want to point out too, he was reelected to the Senate 3 times. His 3rd time was in 1889, and at the time he was in office, senators were elected by the state legislature. It was not a popular vote like it is today. He is the only Kansas senator ever to be reelected unanimously. This was a huge deal. This was his 1889 election. All of the Republicans voted for him. The members of other parties like the Populist Party or the Democratic Party, they either voted for him or they did not show up to the state legislature that day to vote against him. And the reason for that was that even those who were in different parties, even though they disagreed on some things, they all respected him. He was someone they could work with. He was honest. He was forthright. If there was an issue, he could talk to them about it. He could work together with people of different parties. And so they said, well, if it's not going to be someone from my party, I'd rather it be Plumb because I can work with him. So that's an incredible achievement to be unanimously reelected. In 1891, the populist movement in Kansas is growing tremendously. The populist is kind of an offshoot of the Republican Party, and it essentially fractured the Republican Party. There were some Republicans who were incredibly hostile towards the populists. Plumb was not. He saw them as more, someone, a teenager that's gone astray, but they'll come back, we can work with them. They're not that far off from where we are. But he wanted to do one last campaign around the state of Kansas to kind of bring everybody back together, try to recoup some Republican votes. And he reached out to a lot of political figures in Kansas to support him, including former Senator Ingalls. They all turned him down. So, undeterred, he went about it himself. And unfortunately, it was too much for him. He traveled all over Kansas. He had basically a horse and buggy or a wagon. There's stories of him giving a campaign speech. Then he would immediately hop on a horse, ride it to a creek, get in a boat, row across some river or stream, get out on the other side. There'd be a horse or a wagon for him, and he'd head off to the next stop. There's also a story that lots of times his lunch was a combination of whiskey and oysters, a pint of each, mixed together. Delicious. I don't see how he could do that. But even though this was a grueling campaign schedule for him in the fall of 1891, it was successful. They did recoup a lot of Republican votes, brought a lot of people back into the party, but unfortunately, it came at a tremendous cost. In December of that same year, he suffered a massive stroke and died. When he died, this of course was national news. He was one of the most powerful Republican senators and the most powerful senators, period, in the country at the time. When he died, especially this unexpectedly, it kind of threw everything into chaos. And basically, he overworked himself. That campaign schedule that he took in the fall was too much. I forgot to eat for the last couple of days, haven't slept in a couple of days, really finally caught up to him. To give you an idea of how popular he was within Kansas, this is a picture of his funeral procession in Topeka. So when he died in Washington, his body laid in state there. There was a service held in Washington that was attended by the president, the vice president, senators, all the key members of the cabinet. Then the body was sent to Topeka, where 15,000 mourners showed up. This was a tremendous crowd, even for that time, for these sorts of things, for the funeral procession. Then the body was sent to Emporia, and here's a picture from that, where another 3,000 mourners attended. So about 18,000 mourners came. That's how popular he was. At the time of his death, he was getting about 300 letters a day from constituents, and he answered every single one of them. If you wrote him a letter, you would get a response. Now, granted, sometimes his handwriting is really bad. You wouldn't necessarily be able to read it, but you would get a response. I had to transcribe a lot of those letters, and God, I wish sometimes he had someone else write it. He was very well known for having a 2, 3, 4-track mind. He could do multiple things simultaneously. So in the Senate, he would be giving an impassioned speech about something, standing up talking like I'm doing with you right now. And then he'd be holding papers, and he'd be flipping through papers, and people in the Senate gallery would laugh and say, "Oh, look at this senator from Kansas. He's got to read his notes. He can't even give a speech." No, he was reading his mail. So he would be giving a speech in the Senate and reading his mail at the same time. He was also well known to be in his office. He subscribed to every single newspaper in the state of Kansas, which at the time there were hundreds of them, and he read them all every single week. He read all of the local news, and he would do that by doing other things simultaneously. So you would come into his office to have a meeting with him. He would sit and talk with you, and at the same time he'd be dictating 2 letters to 2 different stenographers while reading the newspaper, and he would bounce from one thing to another and never lose his train of thought. And a lot of people couldn't believe that he could do this. and he was traveling to Monticello with a fellow senator, and they were on the train, and he was having a conversation with the senator and reading a book at the same time. And the senator said, there's either you're not paying attention to the conversation or you're not really getting anything out of the book. And Plumb said, no, I can do both. And he closed the book and handed it to him, and he said, give me a page number. And the senator gave him a number, 87, whatever. And then Plumb started reciting everything that was on that page. So he had more than likely a photographic memory, and some other kind of mind allowed him to do multiple things at once. He was also incredibly down to earth. He was not pretentious by any sense of the word. He traveled all over Kansas, and instead of staying in the nicest and finest hotels, he'd stay in the old-fashioned, old-timey hotel where he knew the founder from back in the 1850s. And people would not expect a United States senator to be staying at some old rundown hotel, but he knew the guy there, and so he wanted to stay there. He was very approachable to people on the street, anyone that wanted to talk to him. There's a couple of newspaper accounts. There was a funeral for a state legislature member from Atchison, Kansas, and so everyone came to Atchison for the funeral. And there were, of course, other senators there. It was a big deal, and they were all in their finest suits and their tall silk hats. And the newspaper said, Plumb was there, who looks like he buys his clothes by chance. He came basically down to earth in just a suit, his regular crumpled hat, never an air of pretentiousness or anything. Financially, he was very successful. He had a number of investments in mines, and some real estate, things like that, but you wouldn't know it if you ran into him on the street. That was not how he carried himself at all. After he died in 1891, his wife had to deal with a number of lawsuits. This is actually a really sad story. Apparently it was quite common in those days that if someone rich died, people would come out of the woodwork and say, oh, Mrs. So-and-so, in this case, Mrs. Plumb, your husband owed us $100 from some work we did. Here's the bill, you need to pay that. Oh, Mrs. Plumb, your husband said he was going to buy some stock in this and he didn't. Would you please send us the $1,000? And so they would come after you trying to get money, assuming that you're so overcome with grief you would just pay the money. Well, she never did. And she actually fought every single lawsuit that she got off. She got hundreds of them, and she was successful in beating every single one, which was very unusual for the time. She also managed the money very well, and her son became very involved in a lot of the same projects that he had been within Emporia and within Kansas. She supported the GAR tremendously throughout her life until she died in 1919. The last slide I have here is about the Senator play, and I kept this up last in case any of you want to copy this down. So I mentioned before Plumb was nationally recognized. He was a leading senator nationally. Well, because of that, in 1889, this playwright, David D. Lloyd, partnered with actor William H. Crane, and they came up with this play called The Senator. The plot of the play is fictitious. It revolves around the Denman claim, which was a real thing. It was a claim for damages to a ship that was sunk during the War of 1812. But the melodrama around this is fictional. But the character of Senator Rivers is 100% Preston Plumb. They wrote that part with him in mind. The way he speaks, his dialogue, his mannerisms. You can see Crane there even has the same beard. Everything is Preston Plumb. The play premiered in 1890 and ran for 119 performances on Broadway. It was a smash hit. It toured the country. When it came to Washington, D.C., the actor, William Crane, who was playing Senator Rivers, incorporated all of Plumb's mannerisms and gestures from how he would give speeches in the Senate. Crane had studied him for months. And so when he would do things like stand up and talk and then pat his neck with a handkerchief, all of the senators would start laughing because oh, that's Plumb, that's Plumb. And Plumb and Crane were actually very good friends. They got along with each other very well. There's a story where Plumb had not trimmed his beard in some time. It had grew pretty long. And backstage, Crane said, you know, Mr. Senator, if you don't trim that beard, you won't look anything like me anymore. And Plumb thought that was just so funny. He told it to everyone in Washington. They were great friends. Of course, Plumb dies not long after the play comes out. It still tours the country long after Plumb's death. It was made into a silent film in 1915. Unfortunately, it's one of the many silent films that have now been lost to time, likely disintegrated somewhere, as those films have done. What's interesting is that the script was never filed with the Library of Congress. It was never registered where you could find it. So the last performance of the Senator was in 1915. While I was doing research for my book, I found the script to the play. William Connolly had written a biography on Plumb. He started working on it in 1910. And he wanted to find a copy of the script. And he went to the Library of Congress, he wrote to the writer, different people. He could not find it. Finally, he sent a letter to William Crane and said, hey, by any chance, do you still have a copy of the script? Crane did. Crane mailed his copy to Connolly. Connolly had it duplicated, mailed it back to Crane. And then when Connolly finished his book years later, he turned in all of his notes to the Kansas Historical Society. And within his boxes and boxes of notes is the script to the Senator. And so back in Casper, I got a grant this year to stage a full production of the Senator play. And we actually live streamed it on YouTube. So if you want to, you can go on YouTube and search for the Fort Caspar Museum Association, and you can watch the play. If you want to see what Plumb was like in person, you know, as close as you can get to a living, breathing Plumb, watch the play. I worked very closely with the actor Will, who played Senator Rivers, so we incorporated all of those same mannerisms that Crane incorporated into his performance. So now there is actually a recording of it, and our director for the play actually has a doctorate in theater history. His background is historic theater, and so he's in the process of editing the play a little bit. It runs about 3.5 hours. It's a long play. Melodramas of the 1890s were all-day affairs, but now for community theaters, that's a bit much. So he's working on editing it down a little bit and then republishing it. So we're hoping that hopefully by the first part of next year, the Senator will be available again for other theaters around the country, around Kansas. They can now start to put on productions again of this play. And it is fun. The jokes still hold up. They're still funny. It's a great play. So definitely check that out online if you'd like to see it. That was a lot of information really quickly. Does anyone have any questions on Senator Plumb?
I have a comment. As you were talking through all this, I just thought, there needs to be a movie about this guy.
Funny you should mention that. So one of the things I'm working on, for a lot of authors, they write a book and then they're kind of done. This is my baby. I've been working on this for about 10 years. And now that the book's done, my next goal is to get, at a minimum, a documentary made. So I'm trying to reach out to Kansas PBS, some filmmakers here to see if they're interested in doing something with it. The director of our play, he is actually connected with some people in the film industry and is working on a pilot for a miniseries. So he's actually writing that right now. He asked if that would be all right, and I said, go for it. I understand our odds are, you know, kind of slim.
But the character, he's got everything you need for a
yes.
wonderful movie.
Oh, yeah, perfect, yeah. And the great thing is, with the book, the way I decided to do the book was different than most biographies. It's primarily stories, which for people who are looking, you know, in the film industry that want things to film, stories are already, you know, that's already written for them. They don't have to take the dry, you know, names, dates, locations, and figure out a story. It's all in there. Mm-hmm. So that part's done. So, I mean, I'm fairly optimistic we can get something done. You know, he's just one of those people that he just fell through the cracks, you know, of history, basically. And I think a lot of it was really his personality. He was never one to talk about, oh, I did this or I did that. He just did things. He just worked. It was never about, look what I've done, look what I've achieved. And on this one hand, that's very good. You don't want to be egotistical, but on the other hand, because he never did that, nobody really realizes what he did and how much he accomplished. There's so many things, you know, he was involved with a lot of the military committee work. So things with Fort Riley, Fort Leavenworth we have here in Kansas, that was him. He did that. He allowed, gave them the land to expand, gave them money to add new things to these, he was involved in so many things. And he was just, in a sense, a terror in the Senate. The other senators did not like to argue with him. One, he was good at arguing, he was a good lawyer. And two, because of that photographic memory, if someone was going to argue with him and say, throw out numbers, he had all those statistics in his head to come back at you with, which made him basically just devastating.
Computer.
Yeah, basically. So yeah, he was a tough opponent for sure. There was a lot of talk after he died. Had he not died, he more than likely, or at least they would have tried, made him a Republican presidential candidate. Personally, I don't think he would have done it. And the reason for that being that he detested any kind of pomp and circumstance, that sort of thing. He wanted to work. He just wanted to work. He wanted to put on his everyday clothes, go to the office, and get things done. He didn't want to go out glad handing. He didn't want to constantly give speeches all the time. He wanted to work. And I think, being president would have taken him away in a lot of sense from working. It would have been more of the, now we'd call them photo ops, those kinds of things. And then also his focus was Kansas. He was, one of the quotes I have in there is he was a thorough Kansan. He was Kansas. He lived for this state. And if he had been president, it would have taken him away from that Kansas focus. And, like I tell people in Wyoming, for a long time, he was our senator too. Wyoming didn't become a state till 1890. And so whenever an issue came up, we had no Senate representation. We were the Wyoming territory. We had no senators. And Plumb quickly became known as the Senator of the West. He's the only one who would take on causes for the territories. And so our cattle ranchers and farmers would write him letters. Hey, can you help us with this or that? That's going on in the territory, and he would actually take on those cases for us. So he's incredibly important to Kansas, but to all of these other Western states that were just territories at the time. Very, very significant. And it's sad because, like I say, he's just kind of slipped through the cracks in a way.
Too bad we don't have more people like that in the government. Yes.
Oh, I know. Yeah.
We wouldn't be in the mess we're in if we did. That's right.
No, I like to say, today we have in the government politicians. He was a statesman. There's a difference. And I wish we had more statesmen, for sure. Any other questions or comments or?
So what year did you say he passed away?
He died in 1891, and he was only 54. Yeah, he did more in one lifetime than I think most people do in 2 or 3, that's for sure.
None of his children went into politics or?
No. And I think probably because they saw what it did to him, all that time it took and everything. They were all successful in their own right in different ways. His son Dale stayed in Emporia. He was also involved with the bank there, president of the bank there. He basically ended up managing all of those investments that his father had made. One of the things he did, so while Plumb was in the Senate, he purchased a whole bunch of land around Washington, D.C., which at the time was just fields, because Washington, D.C. was very small. And so he bought this land outside of town, in the hope someday Washington, D.C. is going to grow. Well, he was right. The land that he bought, I don't know if any of you have been to Washington, D.C., around where the Naval Observatory is. That whole area is called Massachusetts Avenue Heights. It's a very, very expensive housing development. Ambassadors' homes, these big old houses are there. Well, when Plumb died, his son Dale partnered with a real estate developer and a home builder, and they developed that whole area. And what's really unique about it is prior to that, all of the housing in Washington, D.C. was a grid system, kind of like most towns are just laid out in a grid. Massachusetts Avenue Heights got special permission from Congress to allow the roads to curve, to follow the terrain. And so because of that, the prices went through the roof. So there's these big homes, you know, overlooking, you know, different parts of the town because they're on hills and the winding roads and that kind of thing. And so his son Dale did a lot of that. And this was in the early 1900s, teens. And, you know, when his father died, see, Dale would have been 22. So about 22 years old, he's managing his father's entire estate, essentially.
He had his dad's brain.
He did. It's interesting. He had his father's brain. He did not have the same personality. He was very, very quiet, very introverted. He was not outgoing like his father. The joke was that, you know, his father, Preston, knew everybody in town, knew the names of all their dogs, their horses, knew everybody. Dale more kept to himself. He knew who everybody was, but he didn't talk about it, you know, kind of a thing. But, you know, being 22 years old, that's a heck of a thing to be thrown into suddenly. And he did it very, very well, very successfully. And his youngest son, Preston Jr., became a very successful lawyer himself. So in that sense, he did follow his father's footsteps. He actually ended up in Southern California. They were one of the ones that moved out there in the early teens, you know, when it was just orange groves and beach, not like what it is now. And so they were very successful out there. And so now, as far as his direct descendants, they're kind of scattered all over the country. He does not have any direct descendants in Kansas anymore. There are some descendants of like his brother George, siblings, but not any of his direct descendants, which I think is another reason why he's kind of unknown. There's no one here talking about him, you know. Any other questions or?
In the other talk, Linda commented that Plumb Hall on Emporia campus is named after him.
Yes.
Does Emporia have anything?
So, no, not really. Actually, that's where I'm staying right now. I gave a couple of programs there this week because his birthday was Thursday. So we had a 186th birthday party in Emporia. No, he's kind of fallen through the cracks in Emporia too. There is Plumb Hall there, and a lot of Emporians know the name.
Yeah,
They know
I
he
went
was
to
a
school
senator.
there.
They know he was a town founder. But all of these other things he did that were incredibly significant, you know, like the Department of Agriculture, the creation of national parks, you know, and I even talked, you know, then about things that he tried to introduce that didn't go anywhere. He pushed for the adoption of a national currency in the 1880s. Well, what do we all have now? A national currency. It didn't go through. He was trying to get that through. One of the last things he introduced in the Senate was actually, it wasn't a bill, it was more of like a memorandum or, you know, a letter, but it was suggesting the creation of an independent council of the leaders of all of the nations of the world to meet together to avoid things like world wars. Basically, he wanted to create a United Nations. This was in the 1880s. It didn't go anywhere. And it kind of makes you wonder, well, if that had gone somewhere, what would have happened with World War I? Those kinds of things. I don't know. You know, I mean, he was incredibly ahead of his time in a number of things. He was for women's suffrage, which was unusual at the time. He's on the record in the Senate arguing for that, in the territories that are becoming states. Like the Washington Territory allowed women to vote as a territory, so he was arguing if it's going to be adopted as a state, that practice should continue. Women should still be allowed to vote. A number of things that, again, ahead of his time. But yeah, you know, there's been kind of a disconnect in Emporia. The nice thing is, since the book has come out, I've been visiting with some folks there saying, oh, we need to have some more information, you know, and I tell them, you know, when I go to Emporia, you know, I drop down from McPherson, you know, take the highway in, and there's the big sign, you know, welcome to Emporia, the home of William Allen White.
Yeah. That's all we know about.
And Preston B. Plumb, where's that sign? And now they're talking about maybe adding that. So that would be great, you know, and I mean, it's not to take away, you know, anything from William Allen White, but it's like Preston Plumb was there first, and then who gave William Allen White the money to start his newspaper? Oh, the Plumb family. And William Allen White was a fraternity brother of the Plumb's family, their son Dale. Dale and him were fraternity brothers, so they're the same, you know, age roughly. But yeah, I think there is kind of some forward movement there, especially with this house. That was something I was involved in trying to save. from being demolished. That was something just within the last couple of years.
Was it safe?
It was.
Oh, okay.
It was. I was frantically writing newspaper articles and giving radio interviews from Wyoming, please save this. So I think there is gradually more of an awareness. It's kind of like, turning a big ship. It doesn't turn on a dime, but we're kind of curving back a little bit, and folks would come up to me like, wow, we should be really proud of this guy. He did a lot. I said, yeah, you should be. Everyone in Kansas should be. Everyone should know who he was. Like, look what Kansas did. Look at the impact Kansas had, on the country, a Department of Agriculture, people go to Yosemite National Park and have no idea, well, the reason you're at the park is because this Kansas senator voted for it and pushed it in the Senate so that the other senators would agree to it. That's huge, so he just needs a better PR campaign.
It sounds like you're it, maybe.
I know, I'm a one-woman PR show for this guy.
Don't overwork yourself.
I know. God, yeah. I know. This year it's been a lot between the book, and we have an exhibit back home on the 11th Kansas right now, putting on this play. I'm not a theater person. I learned so much about the theater this last year from doing that, and then putting in our headstones for members of the 11th Kansas that were killed out there, and then hosting a reunion of descendants of the 11th Kansas. It's been a lot this year. I'll take it easy next year.
Thank you.
Well, thank you.
Thank you.